This is turning out to be fantastic, isn't it? Really? Kevin is the first, actually, of two alumni speakers we're going to have tonight. I had the pleasure of meeting Kevin last year sometime through the MBA Alumni Network. And he struck me as a really uniquely passionate, engaging person. He's actually pretty inspiring. He has this ability to sort of talk in a very thoughtful and nuanced way about a wide variety of topics, especially the ones he's going to be speaking to us about tonight. Sort of how groups of humans interact with the environment and one another, and he's a very insightful character. He, of course, has his MBA from Westminster. He's currently the Chief Commercial Officer at Blue Source LLC, which is a leading developer of greenhouse gas emission reduction products, right? Did I get that right? Yeah, see. He's also the co-founder of Swazi Business Leadership Academy. This is really cool. They provide training and financing to entrepreneurs in Swaziland. And yeah, like I said, he's going to be speaking specifically today about how private business, as opposed to, say, government or charity, can tackle challenges like climate change, poverty, health issues. So please welcome Kevin Townsend.
All right, I'm going to abandon the podium for better or for worse. Thanks a lot, Chad. Is this working? So I want to ask you guys, well, now it's working. I want to ask you guys what comes to mind when I mention to you something that's responsible for the deaths of 2 million women and children each year. And maybe you think about malnutrition or hunger. Maybe you think about lack of access to clean water. Perhaps you think about disease, HIV epidemic, or cancer. Or maybe you think about violence, social or civil unrest, genocide at its worst. But actually, what I'm going to represent is the simple act of cooking. Cooking over an open fire, which is what 3 billion people in the world do, half of our population, is actually responsible for the deaths of 2 million women and children every year. And it's wreaking havoc on the lives of the global poor. I mean, actually, should I switch to the handheld? I'm going to do this. Oh. Now they tell me, okay. All right. I think I'm back. Sorry about that. Cooking over an open fire, which is what half of our population does, is wreaking havoc on the global poor. It takes an average of about 35% of a poor family's income just to afford wood to cook over an open fire. Alternatively, you can elect to spend about 30 hours a week gathering wood, which is backbreaking labor involving miles of travel carrying heavy burdens, and this burden is usually borne by women. And the reward for all this work and for all this expense is simply the ability to provide for one's family and cook over an open fire, which generates air quality in the home that is so poor it's the equivalent of smoking 40 cigarettes a day. And that's for the mother and child. What comes along with cooking over an open fire is rampant deforestation, as you might imagine. For example, the average family in Kenya consumes about 13 trees a year. And when you have rampant deforestation, you have soil degradation, which makes it harder to grow crops. You also have reduced water quality, and it threatens species and biodiversity. So what do we do about this, guys? Should we start a nonprofit, start a charity that creates a movement and raises awareness about the dangers of cooking over an open fire and wipes it off the face of the planet? Well, that's actually been our approach, guys. Charity has been our approach to eradicating poverty for the last 30 years. You guys know what the definition of insanity is? This is one that I like. It's repeating the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that charity is insane. Charity has its place, but I believe it's to stabilize, it's to provide relief. It is not to sustain communities over long periods of time. And pumping $2 trillion over 30 years into poverty, into aid and charity, while we see very, very marginal improvements and arguably moving the needle in the wrong direction, that is insane. It's time for something different. It's time for business. It's time for markets. It's time to invest rather than give. And it's time to stop viewing the poor as helpless and needy, but more as partners. And I want to introduce you to a company called the Paradigm Project. The Paradigm Project manufactures and sells efficient cook stoves to the global poor in East Africa and Central America. And yes, I said sells, not gives. They sell stoves to the poor. There's a transaction that occurs. There's a value exchange. And because there's a value exchange, there's value creation. There's self-worth that is gained from improving the quality of one's life, from providing for one's family. And actually, there's self-worth gained just from the very act of buying something if you're in that position. And a stove costs $10 to $20 US, which is a lot for a rural poor family, but it pays itself back in about 2 months. And there have been independent studies that show that the IRR, the rate of return that can be achieved on a stove over its life, is 5,000%. That's a good investment. Paradigm is a for-profit company. They are not a charity. They have investors and a social purpose at the same time. And they've only been distributing stoves for about 2.5 years, but they've distributed over 100,000 stoves. They've changed 500,000 lives, and their goal is to place 5 million stoves on the ground and impact the lives of 25 million people. That is impact. I'd like to ask you guys what comes to mind when you hear the words climate change. Perhaps you think of the iconic image of the polar bear on the melting iceberg. Perhaps you think of glaciers calving or glaciers receding. Maybe you think of this guy and all of his greenness. Perhaps you think of hurricanes. Or maybe you think of this when you hear the words climate change. You think climate change is a lie, that it's a hoax. And for all those of you out there that do believe climate change is a lie or a hoax, then I refer you to the November issue of Business Week. Maybe. Okay, so we don't like to talk about global warming. We don't like to talk about climate change in the States. It's a taboo topic, or it has become one. And there are 2 reasons why. The first is that we don't want to admit that we're part of the problem. And we've seen an evolution over the past few years in this discussion. First, we just denied the science. Climate change isn't real. It's a theory, not a fact. The data is bad. The scientists themselves are bad. They're fraudulent. Bad people. But the evidence keeps mounting. Now we actually accept the science. But it's not man-made. We're not the contributors. It's a natural cycle of the earth. We don't want to admit that we are a contributor because admission is guilt. And guilt requires change. And change is hard and expensive, particularly with regard to this topic. We know that it's a change. It's going to cost us things that we love dearly, and our money. The second reason why we don't like to talk about climate change here in America is because we think we're immune. Why should we care about a 1 to 2 to 3 degree rise in the climate when our climate is mild as it is? Probably not going to feel it. Why should we care about a slight rise in the sea level when all of our land is several hundred to several thousand feet above sea level? And if you're from New Orleans, just plug your ears for this part of the conversation. And you know what? If every few years a massive hurricane devastates a metropolitan area and causes billions of dollars of damage, displaces thousands of people, costs lives, who cares? It's not my problem. Well, morality aside, it is your problem. Last year, the Midwest, the Great Plains, faced one of the worst droughts in history. That's where your food comes from. And I would contend that the beloved U.S. agriculture industry of today could be the steel belt, the rust belt of tomorrow. So what do we do about it? We should regulate it, right? It's the government's job to keep our air clean, to keep our waterways clean. Well, back in the 80s, right about the time Annalisa was rocking that dress, the EPA, this is 80s, the EPA started speculating. This is our government, started speculating about the dangers of climate change or global warming and greenhouse gases. And here we are, 2013, and our government is speculating about the dangers of greenhouse gases and global warming. My, look how far we've come in 1, 2, 3 decades. Uh-oh. We've been doing the same thing for 30 years, expecting a different result. It's time for something different. It's time for business, it's time for markets, and it's time to invest, not regulate. So my company has been developing greenhouse gas emission reduction projects. This is one of our projects in Pennsylvania for the past 12 years. And in that time, we've been able to reduce about 100 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's the same as not burning 11 billion gallons of gasoline, or taking 21 million cars off the road for a year, or eliminating all the air travel in the States for like 5 seconds. How do we make money? We sell carbon offsets. Now, I'm guessing most of you actually have heard of a carbon offset or know what it is. It's actually very simple. It's a cost control mechanism. It's a low-cost way to reduce your environmental impact. And the example that I always like to give is if you're in the market for a new car, you've decided what you want, and you have the option to pay an extra $5,000 for the hybrid version because you want to reduce your commuting emissions by about 50%. You can do that. But let's just say that you have a friend who's building a wind farm over here. And wind farms are much more cost-effective at reducing emissions. So you can simply just pay your buddy and invest in a very small slice of his wind project, $20, and receive the exact same environmental impact. And guess what? You can double down and pay $40 and take your emissions from commuting to zero. Take your net environmental impact to zero. So if you scale that up on a corporate level, that's what we do as a company. But why would a company buy offsets? Well, they buy offsets if they've identified a market that demands them. Who's the market? And guess what? These companies don't have to eat these costs. Some do, some choose to through corporate social responsibility initiatives, but they can be passed down to the customer. They can be passed up to the supplier. But a company buys offsets when they say, you know what? I care about the environment, and I care about my company. This is good for my community, and it's good for my bottom line. It's sustainability. So I want to take you back to the Paradigm project real quick. How does Paradigm make money? Logical explanation would be they make a margin on the stoves that they sell. Well, Paradigm has actually lost money on most of their stove sales up to this point. They make money through carbon offsets. The very avoidance of combustion of fuel and the avoided deforestation creates a marketable product in the form of a carbon offset. So what's happening now? Lives are being saved. The quality of life of the poor is improving in radical ways. The climate is being helped. Even women in impoverished communities are being lifted up and empowered through job creation. And it's because companies, not donors, and not governments, are saying, we care about people, we care about the environment. And they're putting their money where their mouth is.